All right. We're now going to visit Asia, Africa, and Latin America. President Woodrow Wilson believed in democracy as a way to preserve the peace. Democracy, though, instead of it looked like democracy had triumphed at the end of World War I. But unfortunately, democracy was battered. Russia adopted a dictatorship, so did eventually Germany, so did Italy, so did Spain, and so did all of Latin America. Oh yeah, one of your test questions, our last test. Latin America was to remain under control of dictators for generations. Eventually, Latin America got something that resembled democracy in recent years. But even when I was a kid, Latin America was mostly under control of dictators. Now, to the colonial peoples. The colonial peoples resented European rule. The lower classes among them were treated terribly. They were expected to work the mines, work the factories for low pay and miserable conditions. The upper class ones were given menial government jobs. So the richer colonial peoples were sent off to Europe to be educated. And they were educated in European schools, and they learned democracy and they learned European traditions. They admired Europe for its inventiveness, at the same time they hated Europe. But when the war broke out, the Great War was called then, that was before it was called World War I, it was called the Great War. When the war broke out, colonial people saw that Europe was weaker than before, and they took their chances in rebelling. But the colonial peoples at this time could not win a rebellion against European powers. Yes?
When you say colonials, are you...
I'm talking about African and Asian peoples.
Right.
Yeah, those people, yeah. Not Latin America. I mean, not just I was in Latin America. Latin America was no longer colonial. The United States had said it would not allow colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. But Africa still had a lot of colonialism. And if you look at the old maps, which I looked at when I was a kid, they'll show France had control of much of North Africa, and Italy had Libya, and Great Britain had India. The older maps will show India as being the same color as Great Britain and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Jamaica, all were the same color on a map. The British had the largest empire, which they bragged an empire on which the sun never sets. So there were clubs in these countries that were called white-only clubs. I mean, white people would play golf and not allow the local people to join. And the colonial peoples were beaten badly when they revolted. Religion. A lot of these colonial peoples wanted a return to their old religions, and they viewed Christianity as being a big threat. Into this scenario steps Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi. Now, some college students, when studying him, have actually asked their teachers, could such a man as this have existed? Gandhi was a pacifist, which was in cahoots with the mood of the times. Everyone back then, between the wars, was a pacifist. Gandhi believed in what we call passive resistance. Now, a great American, well-known American, studied Gandhi and copied him. Does anyone know who I'm thinking about?
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. studied Gandhi. Gandhi was against any form of violence, even though, like King, a lot of times violence followed where he went. He's called Mohandas sometimes. Or great soul. Anyway, he encouraged the people of India to passively rebel. Now, his symbol was the spinning wheel, because the British had, well, after they, particularly during our American Civil War, the Southern people thought that, hey, the British will come to our aid because they need cotton. Instead, the British found they could grow cotton in Morocco. Cotton could also be grown in India. But the British would bring these big machines into India to make clothing the new fashion way. Gandhi said to the women of India, no, get out your spinning wheels and let's spin our wool into yarn and our cotton into yarn the old-fashioned way with a spinning wheel. So the spinning wheel became his symbol. In other words, let's rebel against anything modern. Let's rebel against all forms of modern machinery. We don't want automobiles here. We want to go back the old way of living. Now, folk, if you visit India today, they have a lot of automobiles, they have machinery, they have factories. Gandhi's advice has not been followed. But at that time, Gandhi's advice seemed to be the order of the day. He was hard against Christianity because he believed Christianity was a religion that had, there was no R there, it's M-O-H-A-N-D. They believed Christianity was a religion that had subjected them, subverted them. He went to school in Great Britain and in South Africa. He dressed in the old traditional Indian habit of wearing mostly white clothes that were loose-fitting. The loose-fitting clothes was suited to the India's climate because India is a tropical to subtropical country. So these loose-fitting clothes would keep the body cool in under India's bright sunshine, hot days. Well, he did not initially win. India was to remain a British colony until after World War II, and we'll talk more about that later. A demonstration that Gandhi meant to be peaceful turned violent. The British opened fire on demonstrators and killed hundreds of people of India. And Gandhi was arrested for having started a demonstration in the first place, and he spent some time in prison. He eventually met and joined forces with Nehru. Now again, if you had been born when I was, Nehru was to lead India after Gandhi died. But he and Nehru, but they were different. Nehru believed that India should accept Western machinery, accept Western ways, and but he wanted to see India independent. What they agreed on, they wanted India independent of Great Britain. But Nehru believed that India should modernize and westernize. Gandhi believed that it should return to the old traditions. In spite of the fact the old traditions were almost certain to keep the people of India poor, at least most of them very poor. But Gandhi didn't see it that way at all. Now, I'll tell you what we would discuss when I was in school in the 1960s. That India had 4 times more cattle than any other nation in the world, and they had enough cattle to relieve all of their poverty and relieve all their hunger. But they were not willing to kill their cattle because the cow might be their uncle, whatever. I mean, seriously, they believed that when a person died, if he were really good, he'd come back in a better caste, but if he were not so good, he might come back as a cow. So again, they believed that all life was sacred, even animal life. The result was they were in poverty, and you could go around in India at that time, and you'd see trucks going around collecting up bodies of humans, taking the bodies to a dump, and dropping the bodies off the dump, and then using a bulldozer to cover over the bodies. If a man in India dropped over dead, nobody would rush to help him. Nobody would care. Again, you have to understand this was their religion. They believed that their religion lacked compassion. Anybody, I mean, you might have heard this from other sources. Now today, Mother Teresa did a lot to convince them that they should have compassion. But if a person got sick, they'd just dump them off into a house and leave them to die, when a lot of them could recover. And some of them did recover and come back out. But compassion was not a part of Hinduism. Again, the modern world might have changed some of that. Anyway, they saw nothing wrong with that way of living, and they resented the people of Great Britain for trying to change them. Now, later on, the difference between Gandhi and Nehru would become severe. Now, there was another problem that India had. They had a large Muslim population in the north. Well, I'm going to draw a crude map of India here. Up here in the north, there was what is today Pakistan, but it was mostly Muslim. Mostly Muslim over here in what is today Bangladesh, and mostly Muslim here in what is today Nepal. But then most of the rest of India was Hindu. So they had a problem. What do we do with a Hindu and Muslim population? Gandhi refused to answer them. The British would ask him, "Now wait a minute, what are you going to do with a Muslim?" Gandhi said, "Well, let us take care of it." What the British government finally did was, when the British ambassador landed, he had two pieces of paper. One of them he gave to the Hindu leader, Gandhi. Another one he gave to the Muslim leaders and said, "You go form your nation, you form your nation, you form your nation." And northern India became divided into Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And India and Pakistan have been at each other's throats ever since. And it led to a war that Gandhi did not want. Folk, now I want to tell you, I don't like what I'm about to say, but sometimes it appears that war is just inevitable. Try as you might to avoid it, and the harder you avoid it, the more you invite it. We're going to find that out this out when we come to World War II. All right. Well, I'll tell you what my teacher, Mr. Woods by name, said. I didn't know how. He only came to our school one time, and he was one of my favorites. He said the problem with India, and this was 1964 and 65. I was a sophomore. He said the problem with India is its religion. If it weren't for India's religion, they'd be a rich country. Particularly, they had enough cattle, beef cattle, to trade them, sell them, and get rich, as well as relieve all the hunger that was going on among India's poor.
Aren't they all like vegetarian?
What's that?
Aren't most Indians are like they're vegetarian? That's why they don't eat like all those.
They're all vegetarian, yes, I know. And the result is a lot of them starve. And maybe you're a vegetarian, maybe some of you are persuaded to be vegetarians.
I
couldn't have a beer vegetarian.
All right. Now, I'm hesitant to this. Well, all right, I'll say this. St. Paul forbade vegetarianism. I mean, in the most strictest of terms.
But they can eat fish though, right?
Do the people of India eat fish? I honestly don't know.
Wow.
I honestly don't know.
Question. What I
Alright.
heard on YouTube is that in their McDonald's, they have many kind of fish burger.
They do. It's actually not that bad.
No. Okay, moving from India to Turkey. The Ottoman Empire had been weakened for centuries, again owing to the fact, as I've mentioned before, they did not allow freedom of speech. And they didn't allow freedom. And the inventions that were made by Europeans were made by people who were free to disagree with the norm and dissent. The professors would sometimes say it couldn't be done, but some half-educated person would do it anyway. This was the case. Well, the Wright brothers had a high school education, but at the time they invented the airplane, some college professor wrote an article that was saying it can't happen. You can't have a heavier than air machine. And the Wright brothers made a machine that was slightly heavier than air, right at the same year. Same year. Time and again, Robert Fulton, they called his steamship Fulton's Folly, and it didn't work initially. He said, "Give me a few minutes, I'll fix it." He got it fixed, and he put the crowd to silence because his steamship went upriver against the current. Powerful ship. A man named Drake, it was called Drake's Folly. He said that he could drill for oil, that oil exists underground. He drilled and found a vein of oil that gushed up and got him and the people around him all soaking wet. And he saved millions of whales. Folks, there's not enough whales in the ocean to run today's airplanes, trains, and automobiles, but there's more oil beneath our feet than we need. Contrary to what I was told when I was in school, that we're going to run out in 50 years. 47 of those years have gone by, folk, and we have more oil than ever. We're not running out. But anyway, the Ottoman Empire did not have this freedom to dissent, so the result, they lagged behind Europe. Now, here's a story about the Muslim world. In World War I, the Muslim world sided with Germany, and they lost. In World War II, the Muslim world sided with Germany and lost. During the Cold War, the Muslim world sided with the Soviet Union and watched the Soviet Union crumble. Then they decided, if we're going to win, we're going to have to do our own fighting. The people we rely on to win for us can't win. But the Ottoman Empire started with Germany. When Germany lost, there was no hope of driving the British and French out. The French began to take over part of the Ottoman Empire. The British and French then divided much of what was left of it. Now, the Byzantine Empire had existed till 1453. The Byzantine Empire was left over from the old Roman Empire. The Greeks wanted to restore the Byzantine Empire, and they moved in. And they had hopes of taking territory from Turkey, but the Muslims were determined. A bunch of people called the Young Turks The Young Turks moved in and they drove the Greeks out. No, they were determined. And a man took over named Kemal. Otherwise, he's known as He's known by a few other names. He's known as Ataturk. Now, during the year 2000, maybe about the time some of you were being born, they said, who are the greatest men of the last 100 years? And who are the greatest men of the last 1,000 years? So they were comparing from after all 2,000 is divisible 1,000. So who are the greatest men of these times? And Kemal made the list. Kemal's realized that the problem with Turkey is the rest of the world is sub-democracy. So Kemal made some laws that was designed to modernize Turkey. Well, first of all, he forbade the practice of the men wearing the Turkish fez. And in fact, he said, now, when I walk the streets of any city in Turkey, I don't want to be able to tell the difference between a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. So he said, all right, before this time, Turkey had a law that only Muslim men could wear the cap. What was the purpose of this law? They said, this will make a Muslim man look taller than a Christian or Jewish man. Jewish people were not allowed to ride on the back of a beast because this would make them higher than a Turkish man, than a Muslim man on foot. Turkish Muslim houses were to be higher than Christian houses. So you could tell a Christian house from a Muslim house because a Turkish house were higher. Christians and Jews had to pay a special tax that Muslims didn't pay. The idea was to keep Christians and Jews poorer than Muslims. The idea was to encourage conversions. Well, Kemal said this practice must be stopped. He said, I don't want to see any Turkish man wear a fez. Then he said, now folk, he said it out loud, that anyone can convert from any religion to another. In other words, if you were Muslim and wanted to become a Christian, you could. He said it, but it did not actually work in practice. Nevertheless, officially, the idea was to make Turkey more respectable in the sight of the rest of Europeans, all of whom by this time had religious toleration, religious freedom. He said, oh, we have religious toleration too, and he pointed to his own law. Yeah, see, I made a law. But in actual reality, most Muslims did not dare convert to another religion. Anyway, he drove the Greeks out of Turkey. He took the capital away from Istanbul and moved it to Ankara. And it's still there. The Turkish capital is no longer in the old city of Istanbul. He told their women, you cannot wear the veil. And he wanted to be able to go down the streets of any city in Turkey and see a woman and not be able to tell if she was Muslim or not. So he said to the Muslim women, you may not wear the veil. Again, the idea was to try to westernize Turkey. Westernize, modernize, secularize Turkey and make Turkey into a secular state. Women were given the right to vote. Women were given the right to own property. He claimed this country was democracy. It actually wasn't. Now, I'll say this, if you follow the news at all, Turkey recently had an election. Turkey does have elections once in a while. But today, their elections are watched more closely than they were. And sometimes the man in charge finds the election does not go his way. This happened in the last election they held about 2 or 3 weeks ago. The man in charge, I mean, he's still in charge, but the candidate he was rooting for did not win. But anyway, he created a secular modern Turkish state. Today, Turkey is a member of NATO, is considered part of the family of European countries, but still lags behind. All right. Iran. Now, in Iran, to make a long story short, now, all right, all of you, I think, hopefully are aware that Iran is making lots and lots of news today. Lots of it. But a little bit of the recent history of Iran. The Iranians tried the same thing that Kemal tried in Turkey, to make Iran into a secular state. The Pahlavi family took over, and they called the rulers by the title of Shah. In 1979, the last Shah was deposed, but that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. To make a long story short, Iran was for a time a secular state, but it did not work. In the case of Iran, when the last Shah was deposed, a faction took over Iran and was determined to make Iran more Muslim than ever. And a bunch of clerics took over, and they have ruled Iran to this day. But they tried. Now, here's where the United States got involved in Iranian affairs. Because Iran was right there close to Russia, the United States convinced the Iran at that time, the Iranian government, that, hey, we can keep the Russians from coming in and taking over. And we do know that the Soviet Union did have designs on Iran. So we moved in, we put the Shah in power, and the Shah family, about 3 generations of them, tortured their people, oppressed their people, and ruled like autocrats. And finally, the United States gave up on the Shah and told the Shah he'd better leave, which he did, and a bunch of clerics took over and made Iran into more of a religious state than ever. Oil was discovered in Iran during this period we're talking about, and much of the profits went to the British. Now, okay, now this business of oil, this is still going on. Iran still produces a lot of oil, and it looks like they're not about to run out. We are supposedly trying to block Iranian oil from leaving Iran, but it has been said that a lot of ships just seem to disappear right under our noses. The ships will come in, you can tell they're empty. Big oil tanks, you tell they're empty because they're high up over the water. And then when they leave, they're way down in the water, indicating they're full of oil. And in spite of what we think is a blockade, nothing is done about these ships. They just pretty much come and go at will. But anyway, oil was discovered in Iran, and most of the oil went to the British. Most of the profits went to the British. Now, here is something that the Arab countries have done that has hurt them economically. These Arab countries got tired of seeing their oil go to Western countries, so one day they all just nationalized and took over the oil industry. The result is nobody outside will invest in a Muslim country anymore. And this has greatly done a lot to impoverish these countries. Now the money from the sale of oil in these countries finds its way in the hands of a few very, very wealthy, and most people don't benefit. Now this is not always true. For instance, in Kuwait, the average Kuwaiti is richer than the average American. United Arab Emirates, they're pretty well rich, the average person. But in a lot of cases, now I have had students from the Middle East dispute that and tell me, well, you go to these countries and you'll see a lot of cars and a lot of nice homes and whatever. But I've also heard that the average person in some of these countries lives in what we would call poverty. All right. Moving on, we will get back to Iran later, like we will all these countries, but at this time, Iran was being influenced by foreigners, and eventually they would have kicked the foreigners out. All right, Palestine. I misspelled it. Palestine. Now, the word Palestine comes from the word Philistines, Israel's enemy. The Jews were driven out for a while, and for nearly 2,000 years, there weren't very many Jews living in that region. Palestine is the old biblical land, the land of Israel. The people living in Palestine had long been discontent. And I mentioned last time how that Lawrence of Arabia went to this region to try to persuade them to fight the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire broke up, and Britain and France moved in and they divided this territory up. All right, now, this is going to get into some modern times here. In 1917, the Balfour was one of the British noblemen, but anyway, the Balfour Declaration promised the Jews that they could have a homeland in their old land of Israel. And then, when the war was over in 1918, Great Britain reneged on the promise because they did not want to offend the Arabs living here. The Arabs were hard against the Jews. So, the promise made, the Balfour Declaration, the promise made in 1917 was not fulfilled. It was in 1948, but that's after World War II. The Jews are and were especially hated by the Arab people, and some people say the hatred goes all the way back to Abraham and his sons Ishmael and Isaac. Others say it goes back to Isaac's two twin brothers, Jacob and Esau, that Jacob swindled Esau out of the inheritance, and they've hated each other ever since. Be that what it may, there's a constant warfare that's going on between the Jews and their neighbors. Now, this part of the world, Iraq, Jordan is the land just across the Jordan River from Israel. Iraq, Jordan, the British took over what was called a mandate. In other words, they did not outright conquer these countries. They said, what we're going to do is we're going to try to make them ready for the modern world. You know, we have a mandate to get these countries to where that they can, modernize and get ready for the modern world. So they created a mandate to try to get these countries ready for the modern world, and the folk it proved to be impossible. Islam and democracy go together like oil goes together with water. They don't mix. All right, folks, with this, we'll take about 10 minutes. Be back